Right, well, welcome, Internet people. This is the inaugural, very high-tech episode of the Church Fathers, first episode ever. So if you're watching this, you are making history. Well done. Welcome, my name is Ben, and this is Tom. We're going to be your hosts. We are the Church Fathers, and that's what we've decided to name this podcast to. Fathers, to homeschooling dads as well, in England, who are mightily discontented about all of the right things. And we want to let our opinion be known and talk about that and hopefully give you listeners some meat to chew on. So, Tom, tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, so my name's Tom, as you said. I am a dad of three kids. I grew up on the South Coast. My dad was a Baptist pastor, one of two boys. So I kind of grew up around church. Now work in pensions and giving advice. And I'm interested in, I guess, the intersection of faith and culture, faith and politics particularly. So I have a particular interest in ethics and in issues of life, so abortion, things like that, as my wife does as well. So I'm particularly interested in kind of faith and politics, that intersection, what culture's like today, how culture's changing, and how can we build a Christian culture, and how can we speak into that so that people can see what the true Christian message is, which is, I think, is under attack. So I'm interested in those kind of issues. Just recently moved to Yeovil. So live there, getting used to life there, playing football, part of a church, all those kind of things. So that's just a little bit about me. How about you, Ben?
Well, I'm Ben. So I grew up in Manchester. I'm by birthright a Geordie. I was born in Newcastle, and I can pronounce it properly. So I decided to go back up to the northeast for university to Durham, and played some men's lacrosse up there, and then did some teacher training up there, and nearly had a mental breakdown. Decided to stick it with teaching, and got a job here in Old Wessex in the southwest. So I just got to know Tom and his wonderful wife and their children recently, and we decided, yeah, we've got a lot to say after church, so why don't we record it and find another opportunity to talk about stuff. Similar sort of passions. I want to see all of Christ for all of life, and the biblical worldview that that causes us to go out and diffuse in the world, not just save souls, but actually to build civilization. That's my passion. I'm a teacher. I'm really passionate about education as well. Similarly, I don't think it's an option to not be passionate about life. You know, and the political cause of being pro-life, as we understand it, to oppose murder. Really, is the way it should be described. You know, there's all sorts of mercy issues to be extrapolated upon, but fundamentally, it's a question of an innocent baby being torn to pieces, torn apart, and that disgusts me as well. And I suppose before, Tom, we go into your newspaper segment, part of the motivation for this podcast is really neither of us, certainly myself, do not see a positive alternative of meaty, thoughtful, but hard hitting biblical commentary with conviction. Willing to stand on God's word. It's just not out there at the minute, or certainly not in England, in Europe, and I feel like there's been some great movements and some resurgences of potent, really, biblical Christianity and its expressions in the States. And I'm just a bit sick of hearing an American accent, if I'm brutally honest, on my on the other end of YouTube. I'd like to start hearing a few more homegrown and European individuals who are going out and discipling the nations. May we do that? Yeah.
Just to clarify, we're not setting ourselves up arrogantly as like church fathers, as if in 500 years time people can look back and go, Ben and
it was very much tongue in cheek, wasn't it? It was a
Athanasius, Augustine, yeah.
That's Ben.
Fathers. All right, cool. So I'm going to start off then, Ben, by introducing a couple of news stories from the last week. Sublime and ridiculous.
Yeah.
Get your sort of 2 minute responses to, and if we want to freewheel and just talk about them, we'll do that as well. And that's sublime and ridiculous. So, the first news story I saw, starting with the ridiculous. So, jumped onto Sky.com and looked up for weird and odd news stories and found a potty training goes wrong. Firefighters free toddler who got her head stuck in a toilet seat.
Oh my gosh.
So, and there's this wonderful picture, this really great picture of her on the news article. Just it's kind of around her neck, and
That's toilet seat.
what happened? You're a dad. What's the what's your response? What kind of crazy situations have you found yourself?
Yeah, I can only wonder she was trying to inspect how well she'd done. Either trying to do some gymnastics to impress dad, or maybe she had the magnifying glass and the scales, and she was going down to see how well she'd done. I don't know. I don't know how a child gets their head stuck in the toilet seat. Never mind how the firefighters are needed after that.
Yeah. Looking at a picture of her now, she looks in quite some distress. She's got her head through the toilet end of it as well. So, whether or not it's one of those. Is it a potty or is it one of those? Those big seats you stick on the top of the.
Yeah, like the Baby Bjorn ones. Yeah,
I don't know if she's kind of dived in for a drink or not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Next, I've got nothing else to say.
Just Stop Oil. Have you seen the? So obviously we've had a few protests across the last week or two.
Yeah.
From a group called Just Stop Oil, who are one of the latest kind of prominent environmental groups with sort of radical protest practices. Yeah. So you've probably seen yesterday, I Googled this, and the High Court put an injunction to try and prevent anyway, protests around the M25. And what that means exactly legally and how that was designed to stop it, I don't know, because as you may have seen in the news today, there were several protesters who did stop traffic on the M25 today. I can't remember the name of the things across the motorways. There's those kind of like little, I can't remember what they're called, above the motorway. They scale the heights of those and stop traffic. Actually, I was looking at it thinking, why don't the traffic just continue? They didn't look like they're going to endanger the traffic, but Just Stop Oil, they're causing a lot of disruption. They threw, or was it tomato soup at Van Gogh?
Yeah, I think they've done tomato soup at Van Gogh, and in Germany they threw like Kartoffelbrei, so it's like a really liquidy mashed potato at another work of art.
Yeah. What's your thoughts?
I have numerous thoughts. I think fundamentally we're seeing humanism, a new sort of environmentalist paganism at its logical conclusion. And its logical conclusion is, as Joe Boot has said, that the world is chaos and chance, and it can't be trusted. And so the world around you, the environment, needs to be static. Otherwise, you're in danger as a human being, because it's so insignificant in a world and a universe that's basically blind and pitiless indifference, to kind of paraphrase Dawkins. So if you follow the logical conclusion from the root principle that carbon dioxide emitted by humans is the primary, cause of global warming, then you are logical in wanting as few people on the planet as possible, and then at the same time freaking out that we're all going to die. You've got this kind of suicidal on the one hand, and then at this other hand, actually, you want to preserve life your own. You're quite happy for babies to die. You're quite happy for other people to die. You're quite happy for the people in the third world who have brought out of extreme poverty by oil, natural gas, coal. You're quite happy for them to die at the other end of a television screen, or just invisibly, no names, they're just numbers. You're content with that, but you also want to deconstruct capitalism at the same time. I think it's fundamentally hypocritical. I think the desire to industrialize is fundamentally suicidal. And I think it all comes from this root principle that, alongside believing that CO2 emissions by humans are the primary driver of global warming, you also fundamentally want depopulation. I haven't come across any of these radical environmentalists that aren't also saying, we need to radically depopulate the planet. You get these either hanger-on intellectuals with the movement or the people themselves are saying, yeah, the most environmentally friendly thing you can do is have one child, if not less. Well,
Yeah.
follow that to its logical conclusion. I can't comment on why throwing tomato soup at paintings except to get a reaction. At the same time, maybe there is also a hatred of beauty, because if you can't make sense of the order, God's civilization that he has been, building through time, it's that pebble in the book of Daniel that grows into a mountain. It's an irresistible advance of God's civilization. All these good things that we name Western civilization, they're all Christendom. They're all of the fruits of Christian civilization, and might have been bastardized and polluted and renamed, and we might take the fruits without the root. But I see in this hatred of people, I see in this willingness to disrupt everyday life, to block ambulances. I see on the one hand a hatred of the good, the true, and the beautiful, because it reflects God. Because we're made in God's image, we reflect him. There's just a ding, 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 ding. There you go. It's logical conclusion. But the other hand, I see the wheels coming off in a sense for these people, because they genuinely do believe the world's going to end. Maybe the people at the end who are funding this, maybe they don't. Maybe they're just watching the stock shares go up or whatever. But the people, kind of the foot soldiers, the people super gluing themselves to the pavement, really do think we're going to die. So
yeah, no, the lady today I watched a short clip about 3 minutes on BBC of this young 24-year-old, I think she was, stood up there, hysterical. She was hysterical. Yeah. And I thought, one thought after it was, I think she really ought to. She needs someone to come alongside. She needs someone to come alongside her. The police response wouldn't be all that different to someone who was perhaps looking to commit suicide. Like, she was in that kind of hyper state, sort of panic, high anxiety, and so on.
It's possible that some of them are actors. I know. I'm only 28, 27, 28, I forget. All down. I'm 27. These people are my peers. I went to university with them. I work alongside some of the people that are, wear the little Extinction Rebellion badges really proudly as they walk around the workplace. These people genuinely think that unless, we reduce carbon emissions below X and we stop 1.5 degrees, I think, in the next century, these people genuinely think we're going to die. So when you're having that sort of conversation with someone, it's almost impossible to start dialogue, because, as you say, you're talking to someone who is hysterical. And I've seen a few videos where people are really, really calm, but stuff that's coming out of their mouth is insanity, is madness. And again, I must conclude, when someone has not thought through their position, I don't want to ascribe ignorance where actually I think there is malice. These people are quite happy to trade human life. One of the beautiful fruits of progress over the last 250 years has been that we've basically eradicated extreme poverty. Child mortality is dropping all over the planet. People are able to eat. There's more people than ever before. That is just a categorical positive for the biblical worldview. It is not always a good thing if there's just unlimited, untrammeled, welfare supported, easy credit supported reproduction. If you look at a country like Israel at the minute, they are actually paying certain populations like the Berbers who simply have children. It's just the logical outcome of the way that they're giving out welfare. There's nothing against the Berbers. There's nothing against them. If you basically pay people to not work and sit about and make children, and their welfare payments are connected to having children, we live in a world of cause and effect. These things will happen. But as I say, a lot of these environmentalists are functionally, well, they're pagans, basically. They revere the environment, have this concept of Gaia, Mother Earth, and they genuinely believe that human beings are not have the dominion mandate. So there's just this loggerheads that we can't escape with these people, because the root argument is religious. They have a religious conviction that we don't. We have a different one.
Do you think it distracts from the real issue? Because when we think about it simply, one of our mandates is to look after the earth and so on,
Mm,
and it's the Genesis mandate. It's there in the beginning. We're to look after it, to steward it. Um, and so as soon as you introduce these concepts, which are all underlined with panic and anxiety and extreme action, and essentially protesting in such a way that you're disrupting others' lives, potentially even stopping people from getting life-saving care with ambulances and things like that, it just completely
yeah.
removes any possibility of talking in a common sense, rational way about how we are actually to look after the environment, because we do have face some challenges.
Hmm.
No, and I'm no expert on this. I mean, one of the other things that struck me, uh, I just quickly clicked on another news article, which was Environment Secretary Theresa Poppy was talking to business and environmental groups, and they're working, presumably probably with other countries, on a global treaty to end plastic pollution by 2040. And I thought to myself, that's interesting. And then I remembered when we were growing up, I don't know about you, come home from school, get the bus back from school, go
Mm,
to Tesco, maybe buy a can, maybe buy a chocolate bar or something. I'd be given a little crappy Tesco plastic bag,
mm,
home in it. They'd be like, we've come, we've actually come. Some of the things that have happened, we've come a fairly long way, and we do
mm,
know a lot more about things that do harm out the sea or whatever, the plastic and things like that. And they're aiming to end plastic pollution by 2040, and surely that's a good thing. And I just wonder, with all these extreme groups, they get the attention.
yeah.
They almost, for those who are more cynical, and I wouldn't say I'm cynical about the need to do good things to improve the environment, to reduce carbon emissions. I think we need to move in that direction gradually. I think, but we need to test it. We need to actually test what's going on and how things work, and also think about the knock on effects of things we do. But um, my point would be, my question to you would be, is it good to have those kind of goals? For example, you had to start paying for your plastic bags. No one bought them anymore, and they created
Mm.
better lasting plastic. Well, I mean, is it good to create goals to go net zero by 2050? Let's end plastic pollution by 2040. Surely that's a good thing.
Um, it just reminded me actually of a young Dutch entrepreneur who started the Ocean Cleanup Project. Um, I don't want to get his name wrong. The Ocean Cleanup Project, if anyone's listening, and would like to check it out, is actually a superb initiative, and they're really, I mean, just go and check it out. They've got like these interceptor devices. It's all almost like passive energy. It doesn't need energy to collect the rubbish, like the big Pacific garbage patch and stuff like that. And they've got plans. Um, and there's a man who is almost, I think, the same age as Greta Thunberg. And you compare the difference between their sort of worldviews. Greta's an alarmist. Um, this Dutch lad, he was just like, going to get on with it. You know, he's failed something like 40 times. You know, he had a model for the original interceptor, and they went through 40 phases of development until they arrived on something that properly worked. And we're looking at an exponential reduction of plastic in the oceans. Yeah, I agree with you. I think part of our Dominion mandate that was given in Genesis, that was repeated to Noah, that was kind of extended by Christ, is absolutely inclusive of the environment. I think Francis Schaeffer, I'm afraid I forget the name of this as well as late, but he was, I think, remains one of the main reformed thinkers who actually said, "Hang on, guys, the environment's really important, and actually the world that we live in is important, and it was given to us, and actually part of our job is to turn wasteland into gardens. So why don't we just not make it disgusting?" And actually, it's when people sit down and think through the logical conclusions of love thy neighbor. Love thy neighbor does not mean shipping all of our recycling over to the Philippines. It doesn't solve the problem, And there's a parallel here with our sin. We can kick the can. We can try and cover our sin. We can try and hide it. There's so many characters throughout the biblical story, the biblical narrative, who try and run away, and eventually God just catches up with them and says, "Still not resolved. I still demand payment. You know, for that sin because you've wronged me." And again, it goes back to the environmentalist. Who's running the world? If it's a personal universe, there is a person, or we would say three persons in one who are intimately connected with the universe. And Abraham Kuyper said quite rightly, there is not one inch of the cosmos, of the entire universe, of the entire world, where Christ does not say mine. And we're supposed to assume that just because he's sitting on the throne in heaven, as Psalm 110 says, that he's just forgotten about the world and he's not interested in it. No, I think you're absolutely right with your implications of your question. We are to look after our world. The caution, very strong caution that I have, is I just do not think government should have anything to do with that. I think we've seen the 5-year plans with socialism, and that's still raw, fresh memory, in Eastern Europe and particularly Ukraine. I think part of the, this is where things just go off like a hydra into all sorts of topics. But one of the very legitimate grievances that the Ukrainians have against the Russians is basically you've committed genocide against us and you will not say sorry. And that's big. You look at the environmental damage in the old Soviet Union. I think it was the Azov Sea or the Caspian Sea. There was like a lake, and again, name escapes me. Sorry. It basically was just ruined by socialist industry, because where you do not have any price controls, any feedback, where the customer basically has no choice, and businesses aren't put under any pressure whatsoever to use their resources better, to produce more with less, to be more efficient, to get more profit. And we hate profit in the Christian church. We hate using that dirty P word that's profit, but basically, it's one of the most honest things out there. Now, it needs to be trammeled by ethics. That's why we have government, why we have laws, to punish the evildoer, and defend the weak and defend the oppressed. That's also our job. So we don't live in a perfect world. I would much, much rather that an entrepreneur or a charity worker or someone who's just convicted and called by God to go and basically fix the world up a little bit so that kids don't have to swim in plastic and sewage. I think that's a noble goal. I'm afraid that I just don't trust government bureaucrats to do it. I don't trust them because God never gave them that job. And so I think woven into the fabric of the universe means that a government can never do that job very well. And I think also pragmatically, they are not subject to the same market forces that are businesses. So they can do a bad job and get away with it. It's very easy for a bureaucrat to basically get on a podium and have everybody clap because they've said a bunch of words. And it's very, very difficult to actually go out into the world. His name is Boyan Slat. That's the Dutch entrepreneur's name. A young man like Boyan Slat to go out and basically say, I'm going to fix this problem. That's much harder. I hope that's answered your question in part. It is something that's on my heart as well, Tom, because I feel like one of the reasons, Tom, that the extremists, these real hysterical radicals are getting a lot of screen time. Yes, there is, a media, very fixed media coverage, which maybe has an agenda to bang the drum on these sorts of things. I think also it's because there just isn't an alternative voice from the Christian church at the minute. Most Christians probably just go along and say, yeah, anthropogenic climate change. It's like, have you even thought this through from a biblical perspective? It doesn't mean that we're automatically against you. Have you actually thought through what God's got to say about this? Because at the moment, as with most things, if we don't speak up, then truth won't come out, or it'll come out in a weird, twisted way that just doesn't really reflect what God would have us to do.
One thing I think about that I'll bookmark maybe for another episode is I feel like with a lot of these goals and targets that we've set ourselves and that the UN has set and things like that, which is another trainer. Oh gosh, that's not good. Wait a sec.
It's the low tech episode one. I love it. It's just
big time. This is how we start. You got to start low. Set a low bar. Improvements will be astonishing from here on in.
Absolutely.
Well, with all those kind of targets and UN goals and things like that, sometimes I get this feeling that we want to live exactly the same lives we've been living. We don't want to change our lifestyle. A lot of people don't want to change their lifestyle, but they want to be able to say that we've offset carbon or we're carbon neutral or whatever. And sometimes I just wonder, are we missing something about lifestyles and our sense of entitlement, because entitlement is a big issue in our society.
Yep.
Entitlement is everywhere, and one of the things that highlighted this for me, again, so many different trails we could go down, is when Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, announced her policy to send some illegal, I believe it was illegal immigrants, I think, to Rwanda, or is
Yeah.
it?
Which itself is a tricky term, isn't it? But yeah,
Sure. So
go ahead.
Rwanda's had a difficult history, as we know, but life has changed probably in Rwanda for a lot of people. So we're going to kind of move people out there, and essentially, I think it was a policy to try and dissuade and stop people from thinking, let's go over the channel to the UK, let's get some money and let's get a life there because it's easy. We're going to go past all these other European countries on our way, probably. We're going to get a really dangerous boat over,
Yep.
and we're just going to find our way there and we're going to find a life there. So I think it's a policy almost designed to try and show, actually, no, we're not going to mess with us. We're going to send some people over here. And who knows who those people were and why on earth Rwanda accepted them. Nonetheless, a lot of the press coverage around it was very disparaging of Rwanda as a place, and I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, you
Because
mentioned it's a church once. You did a bit of
yeah,
research into Rwanda.
yeah, just a tiny bit, and I just thought it ended up. I realised that we really do have a huge superiority complex in terms of how we live our lives here. Now there are a lot of ethical issues, don't get me wrong, and things like that. But when I researched Rwanda, I just had a quick look. Let's see what their situation is environmentally. What sort of effects are they having? What are their emissions like? Huge difference, because people live local lives. People grow their own food and they eat their own food generally. They don't travel around in, you know, planes loads and whatever. And I just thought this is really interesting because we have these values as a society that we say we really, really care about.
Yep.
And then when we look at completely different lifestyle that actually solves a lot of those problems, we almost don't laud it. We don't go, that's really good, that's an alternative. Because we're so entrenched in our ability to travel, the technology that we live with. And so there's something there, there's a question I've got lingering that I haven't worked out about lifestyle and
Yeah.
about our entitlement, that makes me wonder as well, like, because the people who are shouting the loudest, getting on their planes to go to the COP27 thing, it's like, like there's this, obviously we're all hypocritical, but there's a big question there for me about lifestyle and entitlement and locality, producing things in your own country to be able to provide for people living here. Now there's a limit to which you can do that because we all share resources. We all have different resources across this earth that we ought to share with one another through business. But that's probably for another episode. But it makes me kind of wonder. So maybe we can talk about that another time.
Yeah, the episode should probably be called "The Migrant and the Hypocrite."
Yeah,
because it's pretty much what most of our politicians are, and what most people are, to be honest. I think it falls into this. You're going back to something you said about setting goals with like the UN. I would never be able to categorically say every single individual has fallen for this and is pursuing this for this reason. But UN and basically a lot of these people with Just Stop Oil, they are utopianists. They are driving to effectively build heaven on earth. They're trying to build the perfect place, but the way that they have to, because they have no personal God, the way that they must achieve this utopia is by basically pressing pause, freeze everything the way it is now, because any change is implicitly and intrinsically and absolutely negative, because the human being is not in control. You can't trust it, so it can be dangerous. And quite often, big bad world, big cold empty universe, for me, it's very threatening. And that's fundamentally what drove ancient humanism, drives modern humanism, drove the ancient pagans. That's why they were always trying to appease nature and appease the spirits. And most of the interactions between the Greek and the Romans with their gods, with their idols, was one of trying to manipulate them, trying to win their favor so that they would grant you favor, because the universe was impersonal. It was cosmic indifference, and so you weren't able to do things like science. It is not logically possible from that standpoint, from that viewpoint. It's perfectly possible to do science having robbed it from the Christian worldview. It's perfectly possible to, drill geothermal, drill 5 kilometers into the earth, into granite in Cornwall, like the Eden Project are doing. From a Christian worldview, that makes perfect sense. But, why would you invest in the future? There is no concept of the future. There's no concept of the past, because there's no link. There's no personal connection between anything. It is all just random data. Oh, there we go. Just come up. So there's this desire, this utopianism, this very, they're fervent and zealous. They put a lot of us Christians to shame. They are fundamentally trying to reshape the world. And my concern is whenever a politician comes out with actually a pretty quite a good sounding noble goal, I'm immediately just like, oh gosh, people ain't smart. And if they are, they're really malevolent. So if they've done that by accident, it's just my personal reactions. I get very, very skeptical, because most of the time these people are trying to build their own little tin pot kingdom, and they're really not interested in the world. They're interested in power, and they're interested in inflicting and applying, gathering even more power to, like Sauron, like Saruman in the Lord of the Rings. They want to remake the universe and the world in their image. These are the people that say peace, peace, peace. These are the people that say safety first, security.
Like, Utopia has its victims. Utopia has a lot of victims. Like I think about, the one thing I'm thinking about as you're speaking is Bill Gates. Now, obviously, one of the big things that Bill Gates Foundation has done is, as far as I'm aware, and I haven't looked into this lots, but they certainly have done this, is gone into Africa under the guise of providing reproductive healthcare, and essentially bringing their own cultural views about children and family into Africa, and saying, look, we're going to help you. We're going to emancipate you, women. So effectively, they wouldn't use this language. They're going to emancipate you from your slavery to this culture and to bearing lots of children and having a big family. We're going to do that by providing you with healthcare, and basically providing lots of contraception, ability, access to abortion. That would be their big driver. And it's like, all the language is positive, all the language is healthcare, all the language is rights, but they're shifting across their own cultural attitudes, and without any, almost, again, it's that patronizing thing of, we're better than you, we know how this works, we know what you need, we're going to give it to you. But there's no sense in which, like, let's look at a different culture, and let's sort of pause for thought and think, what is it about this culture that is more beautiful than where we live? Is there anything that is more beautiful? Because obviously this is coming from a biblical worldview, where I see their willingness to have big families as a wonderful thing, and to live simply as a great thing. And yet they've got these organizations coming over, promising them the earth, and just pulling them into a completely different worldview. And Utopia just has victims. In fact, I just think about Utopia. You said the word Utopia, and I remember we read a lot of great dystopian novels at school. We read 1984. We read Brave New World, The Handmaid's Tale, and I thought these were all really fantastic.
White women with a persecution complex.
I just had a thought, like, utopia and dystopia. Like, aren't they just, like, I think in this world, unless there's any kind of a heavenly view of what is now, the kingdom now and the kingdom to come, you think utopia just ends up being dystopia.
I mean, I can only recommend you and others check out Joe and the Ezra Institute on this, because he is superb and superbly succinct at writing about these sorts of things. I'm working through one of his seminal works, The Mission of God, at the moment, and in it he just takes an axe to the root of humanism and of Neo-Paganism, really, which is what the environmentalist movement is effectively. Fire worship and stuff like that. It's there's so many heads to this dragon, But fundamentally, the root, the throat of this dragon, the heart of it is, I will be like God, and I will remake the world, and I will take on the attributes of him. And whether that's conscious or not, if you believe that you live in an impersonal cosmos, then you are the next closest thing to God because you're made in his image. So you are the source of worship. Is it any wonder that in antiquity, the pharaohs and the emperors and the kings like Nebuchadnezzar, they were worshipped as gods because they were the absolute pinnacle of collective man, which in today's days just the state, if you will, big government. So they took on the mantle of divinity, the ability to make sense and to declare what the cosmos and nature should be. And that's what I see it as the root sort of religious driver of all of this. It has multiple flavors, if you will, it has multiple outlets and the way that it's expressed. But fundamentally, these people believe that the universe and nature is against them. It's impersonal and it's not their friend, and they need to control it. So it's very interesting that these people who are pro nature and want to look after nature and defend nature and have more wildlife and bring, rewilding projects everywhere, these are the people that actually fundamentally have the biggest desire for domination of nature because they want to stop it. They want to press pause so that everything stays the way it is. Progress, does not make sense in their worldview because progress implies an idea of the future. But progress is also, a dirty word because that implies change. And you've got to understand a fundamental religious impulse for these people, unconscious or not, is change is bad because I can't control it. Whereas we would say, actually, most of our lives as Christians really is just holding our Father's hand and letting him take us into the unknown. And just saying it like that, cosmic indifference, holding my Father's hand. The change is, I'm just smiling now because I'm talking about my Heavenly Father, but change in mindset. I mean, added to all of this, are we surprised that despite, we're going to get onto euthanasia in a minute because I've got two articles for you to talk about, but we should not be surprised that deaths of despair, if you will, like suicide, and to an extent euthanasia, that's not really death of despair, but suicide, drug overdose, alcoholism. I suppose you couldn't call it a death of despair, but horrific violence against the family and all sorts of social ills we call them, but basically sin, systemic sin in the collective of Great Britain and Europe. Why are we surprised when we have a fundamentally nihilistic, depression, despair, as the mindset of most of the people? This is the soup that we're educated in. It's the soup we breathe, and that we're raised in, as sort of the the attitude. This is the public religion, which is humanism. We're not a Christian nation. We're not a Christian continent anymore. We've backslidden. We're apostate, and what we've got instead is humanism. We ourselves must be gods, and that is a tremendous and dreadful burden to bear. We weren't made to do that, Tom. We weren't created to bear that glory and to bear that responsibility. Moving on to euthanasia and this idea of control, I've got two headlines for you. So the first one: the widow who paid £10,000 for terminally ill husband to die in Switzerland calls on the UK to change its euthanasia laws. Off you go.
Wow, yeah, this is, and you just said some key things there. Often I think about the language that we use, and the language that we use in our culture says a lot about what we value. And like, for example, one of our favorite words is rights. One of the least used words seems to be responsibility.
Yeah.
What other words? I mean, one of the words that I've thought about particularly that we don't talk about, and this is a very Christian concept, of course, is sacrifice, or even pain, maybe. And it's interesting. I just read the first bit of this article, Just how the media. I was interested in how the media report stuff and how they use language as well.
Yeah.
So, for example, second sentence of it, after telling us about the widow who's reluctantly travelled to Switzerland to end his life, is UK laws do not allow assisted dying. So Anne Norfolk's husband, 65, had to end his own life in a foreign country in 2012. It's designed to make you think, oh gosh, you have to go somewhere else.
Mm.
This
Yeah.
intrepid sort of journey to this other country, this compassionate other world in Switzerland, where he was allowed to die of his own choice. Now, it's easy to sort of it's easy to think, well, actually, we know euthanasia isn't a good thing. Shouldn't put our own bring our own lives into our hands, like you say, be like our own god. This chap had motor neurone disease.
Yeah, I was going to say he had MND, which is
tragic. So, I mean, we had a work colleague a few years ago who was diagnosed with motor neurone disease, and I don't think he lived much longer than a couple of years, and left young daughters.
yeah.
It was horrific. So yeah, it is exactly the same can of worms that we had now. How many years ago? More than 50 years ago now. 55 years ago, I think, when the abortion law was passed. So what was one of the terms that people use? Safe, legal, and rare. One of the terms that was used, or either at the
Anything that
time.
stayed the same is legal. The only thing that stayed the same.
Exactly. Now you can do it at home yourself. So it's a can of worms, and we've seen some. I think I read some news the other day. I can't remember which country, where I understand it was going to be made legal for some children in certain situations. I think potentially.
Yeah,
So
well,
what you've got
if
here is
if I may,
vulnerability.
Tom, as soon as it's like when the plane crash lands and you have to inflate the slide, right, out the door to get to the lifeboat. Like, this is a slide into the abyss. Like there is, they're like, oh, we'll just stop at 3 months. Like, it's just logic, just incoherent. Like, if you want to kill because something's inconvenient, why stop 9 months? The only reason is the ick factor. It's like, oh, well, it's a living baby. It's like, yeah, we've been telling you that all along. But, we've already seen leaked footages and maybe people just being honest in a moment where they didn't think they were on the camera, where they've basically been like, yeah, kill babies. Yeah,
Yeah,
kill
right.
living
The
babies.
abortion didn't work. The birth. Yeah, we've heard stories, haven't we, where the abortion
Just,
failed.
just stab some scissors into the back of its vertebrae, death. Like, of course, you people think that. Because yours is the culture of death, and you start from a religious principle, and there's this disgusting tree that grows from that seed. So I'm just intrigued on why your thoughts on why it's not being called assisted suicide anymore. The word's too hard. It's not actually dying, is it? It's just dying. It's not dying. It is actually a suicide, from which I understand it, and I probably should know it as a linguist, is self-violence. It's inflicting violence upon yourself. I could be wrong, but if I may, there was a tragic situation. It's tragic because we can't see all ends, and it is horrible when people take their own lives. And there was the child, one of the teachers at the school I work at, and it was awful. It was absolutely awful, and it wrecked both of them, the mother and the father. But the thing that stuck in my throat a little bit was when she came back to school. She'd taken months off. Totally understand. She really needed to process it, and to be honest, I'm not sure she ever will. But the way, dare I say, arrogantly, I've got on her soapbox and said, "Now, whenever you talk to us about this, do not use the word suicide. That's an aggressive word, and it's inaccurate because, he was unwell. He was mentally ill." And I thought to myself, well, first of all, thank you for telling me what I should say and how I should speak. But second of all, I thought to myself, he may have been mentally ill, mentally unwell, but that still does not qualify. This doesn't give us any right to presume that we have the right. Well, it doesn't give us any right to presume the right to cancel that most basic thing that God's given us, which is life. I thought it was just very interesting that even the language, the vocabulary around euthanasia has been changed. Kind of remove any idea of guilt, any idea of responsibility.
Yeah. You've hit it on my head. As you were speaking, I was just thinking, all this kind of softening of language, generally speaking, what it's doing is it's diminishing responsibility of the individual. So even mental illness, as someone who's been through mental illness myself,
Yeah.
actually got quite close to a hopeless situation, feeling hopeless, feeling like I should end it. I've been in that place. Sometimes even the way some doctors and people spoke to me, with things like, you're always going to have this particular condition, this kind of depression or whatever. And there's certain things they'd say, but also there is that sense in which, even in criminal cases, there's that whole element of diminished responsibility and things like that.
Criminal
But
pathology.
I think as Christians we can't accept that. We can understand there are factors that go into how people make bad decisions, but we can't accept this sense of diminished responsibility, and that softening of language is all doing that, isn't it? That's all what it's designed to do. Now, of course, I make no comment here at all on suicide and salvation and anything like that. I'm not touching on that whatsoever.
No, not touching that. Maybe another episode, but that is viewers, listeners, please do not read anything into our conclusions on that. At all.
Language and calling a spade, I suppose, aren't we? Yeah, and what was the other thing I thought just then about the euthanasia? I mean, as Christians, I guess one thing we've got to do, thinking about like what can we actually do, what positive hope can we offer others? There's amazing positive hope we can offer, because we're told that our bodies are wasting away, but that's bringing us closer to an eternity with Christ. So we have a great hope to offer. I think without, like you say, without the Christian worldview of pain, of eternity, of suffering with Christ as well. So joining your sufferings to Christ.
Yeah.
Within your pain and your suffering. Without that, what else? Society comes up with solutions to offer its own hope to the world. And that hope is the best hope they can offer, is to say that you can die without more pain. There's no offer, that is their gospel, is to say, look, you've had your life, why don't you finish it now without any pain? Yep. And we've got such a greater hope, and such a hope for those times, and also the belief in a God that, I don't know if sovereignty is the word I want to use, but a God who is so much greater than our sicknesses and our sufferings. One of my uncles had, it's terrible, I can't. He had, I think it was dementia. This is terrible. And so for many years towards the end of his life, he was, his wife went to visit him often, but he was not the man that he once was. But at the same time, I believe and I trust that God could still communicate his grace to him, and somehow he would at times within that confusion been able to understand God's love for him. So things like that, and so we have to offer this hope. We have to offer this hope for babies. We have to offer this hope throughout all stages of life, and particularly at the stages of life where we're most vulnerable. And that's the thing, isn't it? All these things, abortion and euthanasia, compassion is the world's logo for them.
Yeah.
But in my mind, we're talking about harming the most vulnerable people. And even with euthanasia, the most dangerous thing is other people being influencing. So burdensome relatives, what point does someone influence that relative who is a burden to them, to be able to make their own decision to go for euthanasia? There's all these kind of issues about vulnerability and who actually behind these decisions and things like that. So it's
the concept of useless eaters, and to be honest, that's been present throughout most pagan societies. The Native Americans had it, the Romans had it. Basically, the idea that you got to a certain age, you were a drain on resources. The most honourable thing to do was to kill yourself, or put yourself in such an awful position of exposure that you would die, which practically is the same thing. I might jump off a bridge, but at the end of the day, it's it's the water or the road or whatever I land on that kills me. But I've still put myself in that position. I'd say there's still an ethical responsibility that we have and not to put ourselves in harm's way like that. But two things that you that I came to mind as you were speaking. The first one was that basically, if you stare into the abyss, then you realize, and what I mean by abyss is just genuine nihilism, like despair. I'm looking at a hopeless future. There is no hope. Then I can't make sense of my pain. I can't make sense of it. And actually, I am in that situation in this worldview, which I don't agree with, but back with me. I am just the random victim of random unfairness. But then again, fairness is not a concept that can exist because there's no such thing as justice. It's all just random. So it is just randomness acting upon randomness, because that's hard. To actually make sense of that when everything's going well, like an Andrew Tate sort of figure. He's got his little harem, living in Romania with his nice cars and getting billions of views, just being an a-hole, being unethical. Fine. It's when the rubber hits the road and things get hard that having a worldview that has no hope is crippling. And we pray for Andrew Tate like every other sinner. That man is just particularly blatant about it. But he's living the high life at the minute. I don't know what demons he's got to deal with, and I don't know what God's got in store for him. I pray Saul of Tarsus can become Paul. I pray that Andrew Tate can be redeemed and restored. But the example I gave is simply that someone who is, at least externally, living the high life. It's a little bit like the prodigal son. Probably wasn't thinking too much about home and how difficult his life was when he was partying. It was when he was mucking it with the pigs that he's like, it's pretty rubbish. And to be honest, I'd rather muck with pigs than have motor neurone disease. So I do have pity. And my middle brother, it suffers. I don't know if he suffers. He's got the mind of a child, a very young child, and he's severely disabled. And my mother and father have struggled with that. My late father and my mother raised, I've got endless respect for them because they did it at a time 20, 30 years ago when basically there's almost no provision, for special needs kids and the disabled community. Yeah. Well, these days the answer is, well, why don't you just abort him? And it's like, I don't think you appreciate that God's got a plan. And I don't think we appreciate, any of us, what big picture truly means from God's perspective. And it reminds me of John Piper's sermon, which is kind of interspersed in a song by, they called You Slay Me, by Shane, maybe. There's this just very powerful moment that's moved me to tears multiple times where, John Piper himself's cracking up and he's like, and a car just comes in and on the pavement, on the sidewalk, and just wipes her out. You get cancer, and he just goes through all of these things, and he's genuinely broken. And I'm just sitting there thinking, yep, I can identify with that, because there's been some things where in my, my worldly self, I thought, that's not fair. God, that is not fair. Yeah, it's the truth that Piper says, and the truth that he doesn't say. The truth that he doesn't say is that there are mysteries we don't understand. His ways are above our ways. And that's a great comfort. Like Gandalf speaking to Frodo, You don't understand, we can't see all things, but it's not for you to decide. And the thing that John Piper does say, running out of time, we're going ourselves too much on. The thing that John Piper does say is it's not meaningless. It's valuable. It's worth something. How you front up the pain and struggle and suffering has meaning. And we don't have enough conviction and trust in God to declare to a world that's screaming in agony, and screaming in pain and frustration, the unfairness that they perceive, to basically say, our God is in control, and we will grieve with you, we will mourn with you, we will celebrate with you, but we can give you the pirate map, the treasure that is Christ. And the last thing that I was thinking of when you were speaking was that the compassion of the world has a price. It's going back to what you said before about there are victims of utopianism. Yeah, you were rotating. That utopia has its victims. Well, the compassion of the world has its victims as well, and the price must be paid. And I can only help but wonder. Well, the compassion of Christ, He has already paid, and so actually, the true compassion is one that is fulfilled. Christ can say, "It is finished." You will go through suffering, you will go through trials. It's finished. But ultimately, I make all things new. I bring all things into completion. I am the Alpha and the Omega. I finish this circle, guys. Don't worry. I bring it all together, all into completion. Don't worry. Whereas the compassion of the world is basically just to say, we can give you the dead end if you stop earlier. And I just rough. It is rough. Motor neuron disease is rough, but Christ is the answer, and we can't underestimate the suffering that people go through, but it has meaning, and
That's really good. Yeah, it's really good to think about the depth of the Christian message, because it has something to say about everything, about all of life experiences, and especially suffering. And I love that you said the word mystery, because when we embrace suffering, if we can embrace the mystery of that suffering and unite ourselves to Christ in it, then we've started on a journey to being closer to God within that and giving it to Him. And I love that you said that word. You know what? I think, I don't know about you, but I think that's as much as I wanted to talk about some other stuff, I think that's a pretty good place to finish.
just put a post-it note on your laptop, and we'll just end up with, we should talk about that next time, and then next time we'll talk about it, and we'll not talk about the thing we plan.
I think the Church of England and marriage, that will keep rumbling on for as long as you want. So,
well, right, in a snapshot, okay, 30 seconds, Tom. Bishop of Oxford is
Bishop of Oxford.
What's he doing? What do you think?
46 or 52 page, can't remember, essay outlining how he's changed his views on marriage, coming from an orthodox position of marriage only being between a man and a woman, changing his position that the Church of England should now bless and marry those of the same sex, and also including clergy as well. So obviously there's been this whole conversation within the Church of England in the last, I don't know, 5 years or so. I think it's called Living in Faith and Love. I think that's what it is. Their whole consultation on this matter. But effectively, I think my very short view is that they've already opened the conversation. They've already welcomed it all in. It's already been practice happening in many parts of the church. They're on a trajectory. I don't think that trajectory is going to be thwarted, unfortunately. I think many churches are going to leave eventually and not be able to be in communion with one another. But he's the biggest, most senior bishop to have come out and stated his position before they've actually made a decision on it. And loads of other bishops have now come out in support of him. So it's been some great responses from people, from pastors who are engaging with his arguments. And his arguments, I say there's a lot to be said about his arguments, and I think they're really weak. And he actually shows his cards as well about how he wanted to find a new way of interpreting scripture in light of some of his pastoral experiences. So that kind of tells you enough.
I'm surprised it took him 52 pages, to be honest.
Yeah,
I could have basically summarized what his argument is in one sentence.
Sure.
I want to be the judge. At the end of the day, God tells us what's right and wrong, and there are some things that the world says that are perfectly acceptable. And even from a non-pragmatic, even if it was a pragmatic perspective, putting that to one side, even if there were absolutely no downsides, being disobedient to the word of God is still a problem. And I think, this bishop has shown his cards. My suspicion is that he never held an orthodox position, and they need to rubber stamp and strong arm the institutional Church of England into giving this some sort of veneer of respectability. It's so amusing when God says, to think that God says judgment begins in the house of God. Right? What happens in the church? It's like the head of the river. It will get to the mouth. So if we put sewage into the church, the culture eventually, a year, a generation, doesn't matter, will start to see, smell, and start to basically be soaked in sewage. So amusing to me that in this situation, in this descent, the church is the last one. The church is kind of at the end. It's almost like it's just it's just like a dumb sheep. It's just like, yep, me, give me judgment. After everything else has happened, it's like, okay, well, we're going to be the last of the party. We're not. It's this flipping where the church is, it's the butt of every joke. The church is the scorn of the world, rather than being the light and the salt and the glory of the world. That mountain that all the nations go to say, wow, we want what you've got. Well, that's not happening at the moment. And what is happening is that the church is basically being trodden underfoot. And that may be why it's last, because it's literally at the bottom. It isn't stepping forward with a beautiful alternative. It isn't willing to, get a bloody lip and start throwing punches to the idols of the world. It isn't willing to have a fight. It wants to be winsome. It wants to be respected. It wants to be invited to the cocktail parties. It wants to be invited to preach at the royal family's wedding, without saying one word that could offend anybody at, in that ceremony. So it's this flipping that, God says, well, I will make the wise fools because my foolishness is wiser than the wisdom of the wise. Quote. And it's also, I will speak through the mouth of a mule. God just flipped everything on the head. He has children, declaring the glories of God. It's almost like his modus operandi that whatever we think just comes in and he's like, apart from me, all of you are fools. So I'm going to speak through the mouth of a donkey. I'm going to have children lead your armies, and sheep. And I'm going to have lions and lambs lie down together. And it's glorious. And it's amazing. And I just see in the Church of England an old, it barely used, crusty, irrelevant wineskin that we should have thrown on the rubbish heap a long time ago. And I think God is doing that. I think the lampstand has been, and the salt has been removed from the Church of England for a very, very long time. And we're just seeing, sadly, this almost like rigor mortis that's setting in, just a descent into depravity, into madness, into ignorance. And eventually the church will be irrelevant because it will look exactly like the world. It has nothing else to offer. So that's another episode I'd love to chat through with you, like a long form podcast episode, just the idea of new wineskins.
Yeah, that'd be a good one. Yeah, there's so much that could be said. And ironically, Church of England and Archbishop of Canterbury is meant to lead the worldwide Anglican Communion, but the worldwide
being schooled by Africans, you mentioned Rwanda. Like,
completely. So right. That was really interesting. They came over, didn't they, for their General Synod in a few months back, and the GAFCON bishops were like, we're not going to have communion with the rest of, not some of the bishops who are in same-sex relationships openly in America at the Episcopal Church, like, because communion means something, like we can't just share this bread and this wine.
Well, why don't we save that conversation about Africa for next time? With the migration, Rwanda, communion meaning something. All right, I love that. All right, mate. God bless. Good night.